Thank you very much for joining us. I apologise, this is slightly later than we had asked you to come for, and welcome. Can I ask each of you to just introduce yourselves and your organisation, and also respond to the question that we had at the very beginning, which was to tell us your view on what the increase in Islamophobia or not has been, and particularly we're concentrating in this discussion on online abuse and hate crime. Dr. Allan.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Chris Allan. I'm an academic from the University of Birmingham, and I've been researching the issue of Islamophobia since the late 1990s. I was co-author of the EU report on Islamophobia in the EU, 15 EU member states post 9/11 as well, among other things. In terms of the question. I would say that the statistics definitely show that there has been an increase in the levels of Islamophobic hate crime over the past number of years. I think that one of the things that we have to bear in mind in terms of this is the fact that there's not been a kind of systematic or consistent approach to actually recording Islamophobic hate crime. If you look back even 5 years ago, the actual evidence that we have is very, very sketchy. Organisations such as Tell Mama previously, but also changes within the police forces as well, and the recording of using the flag around Islamophobia have become useful. But I would say that in terms of that there's still significant problems in terms of looking across, in terms of other kind of forms of hate crime, expression of hate crime, in terms of getting something which is consistent. Just briefly to just open, and I'm sure we'll take it a little bit further, but I think that one of the things in terms of the media, in terms of the hate crime, the relationship between that, is that the media tends to inform what I would suggest is a kind of white noise which exists around Muslims and Islam in the contemporary setting. It kind of informs the tone of the debate, it informs the tone of discussion, and by default it informs the tone of people's views and attitudes towards Islam, whether that's a form of anxiety, whether that's a form of threat, or whether that's a fear. And I think that one of the things that we can do is we can look at the media and see that in some way that white noise which exists somehow validates the ideas or the views or the attitudes of the perpetrators of hate crime.
Okay, Dr.
My name is Dr. Imran Awan. I'm an associate professor in criminology at Birmingham City University. I've looked a lot at Islamophobia, especially on the internet and online spaces. In terms of coming to your question and sort of trying to delve a bit deeper in terms of some of the triggers and causes. In particular, some of the work I did recently was around this link between online and offline anti-Muslim hate crime, and this idea that, in effect, it's a continuity and they shouldn't be looked in isolation. This idea that for victims in particular, if they suffer online, that offline those experiences become a reality. And I can give you some examples. We had a case of somebody who had a Twitter account created about him saying that he was from Rochdale, Rotherham, he was a paedophile, and various other things. And when he spoke to us, he said that actually he had found it hard to find a job because people were looking at these social media posts and they were linking the two together, that, well, hang on, this guy must be a paedophile, even though he was innocent, and he had gone through a whole police investigation and so forth. So I think there's a real continuity and a link in the sense that we shouldn't look at them separately. The other thing is, for a lot of the victims that I've spoken to through my research, there's a real sense of them living in fear in the offline world. And so, for example, we had one lady who said that she had to change her security locks on her door because somebody had found her address, they knew where she lived, and it had impacted her on a day-to-day basis. And another individual who similarly said when she was going to work, she was actually performing badly at her job because of the threats she was experiencing online. Trigger events has been discussed a lot, and I think what's important to note also from some of the work I've done is that they don't just spike when it looks at international events. They do because we live in a globalized community, but local and regional events like Rotherham, the Trojan horse scandal, those events also lead to this escalation that spikes and then sort of goes down after the first 48 hours, if you like, apart from Brexit, where we've seen a real increase. So those trigger events do lead to this escalation. as Talmama have reported previously, Muslim women are most likely to be the victims of this, and males are most likely to be the offenders. What's interesting, because I think you started off by saying, well, this is about online hate. In particular, for victims of online anti-Muslim hostility, they remain less visible in the criminal justice system, so we hear less about them. And that may be for a number of reasons, because of trust reporting mechanisms, and for some of them they feel that, well, actually nobody's going to take them seriously. And I'll just end on this point before I pass it over. This sense of fear, especially for women, is a real gendered dimension of Islamophobia in terms of how they have to deal with it. And for men, they're much more unlikely to report incidents because of fear that they're going to be considered to be weak. But it's the visible identity that was quite often the trigger point, because either a Muslim woman may have been wearing a headscarf, or a male had a beard, or they were talking about Islamic issues on social media. So that, just in a nutshell, summarizes some of the points you were asking. I'll pass it over.
My name is Murtaza Shaikh. I'm a co-director of a think tank called Averroes. Our main areas of work are Islamophobia, extremism and integration. One of the reasons being that we think they're incredibly interrelated and interdependent. We also do some work on sort of capacity building within the Muslim community to engage better with politics and parliament and so on. In terms of our written submission, I think our main point, which impacts on social media, is the idea of whether there is a need for legislative change in the specific area of hate speech, and how that can be used to stem Islamophobia. In terms of data, I mean, the only specific data that we have, that I've come across, which is specifically to do with online sort of Islamophobia, has been the Demos report, which clearly indicated that there was a spike, there was a consistent increase, and that it correlated, and there were spikes which correlated with sort of terrorist incidents abroad, most prominently Nice, Normandy, and the ones that took place in France. But obviously we have the figures from the Home Office, we also have the figures from Telmam, and I would also agree with Chris that we don't really have a uniform approach to collecting this data. It shouldn't really be just think tanks and third-party organizations that are doing this work, because without the data we can have questions such as, does it exist? Is it going up? Is it imagined? Is it perception? And so on. And I think all of those are valid points to make. And I would also emphasize, for example, with Imran, that it's not just about data. I think it's very important to, like Talmama said earlier, to get those sort of qualitative pieces of research and information about experiences that people go through. And the last point would be that I think we can't sort of ignore the idea of perceptions within the Muslim community, because the perception itself becomes a hindering factor to when you operate in the outside world. And I would link the social media to the outside world as well, because if you have this sort of mentality that the outside world is Islamophobic, and let's say you're a Muslim woman who wears the face veil, for example, and you think everyone hates you, you're going to behave in that way. And I think the same goes for wider society. If wider society thinks that this is sort of these people think in a certain way, or they buy into some of the narratives and tropes that are pushed forward, then they also have an uneasiness, and you know that doesn't aid integration and interaction.
And how are people changing their behaviour in response to abuse when it comes to online?
Well, we had one individual who we spoke to who said that she'd suffered some horrendous abuse. Her pictures, there were fake profiles created about her, and there was somebody who was actually saying to her, look, we know where you live, where you go to work. She actually stopped taking the specific route of public transport that she would take, so she'd go the other way. And in the evenings she would purposely not travel because she said, look, after this specific time it's quite dangerous and I'm more vulnerable. So there was a real, again, linkage between how this online behaviour was leading her to feel a sense of real fear. But also the other element about, and I talked about impact before, there was a real sense of, in one case, the lady was taking antidepressants because of this, and she was suffering anxiety. And she had said it had impacted the way she was taking her child to school, and in effect the school were talking to her and saying, look, is everything okay? So there was a real sense of lack of self-esteem, confidence, anxiety and fear, because you never know if that online space is going to come out and actually do something.
I think that one of the things is whether it's online or offline, what we have to remember with any form of hate crime on whatever basis that hate crime is being perpetrated is the fact that if you're attacked randomly, or you're a victim of a crime which doesn't involve the recognition of who you are, then you have to put that in context with hate crime. And hate crime cannot be seen to be random, because it specifically targets the part of your identity which is probably the most important to you. So if you're attacked online, or whether you're attacked in the street, you're being attacked if it's motivated by Islamophobia because you're Muslim. So it's your identity, it's your very core of your identity which is actually being attacked, which is being targeted, which is being identified. So in some ways, that even if it's a random comment which is tweeted online which says, I hate you because you're Muslim, I mean, it'll probably be a lot worse than that, but still, the fact is, it's actually touching you much more closely. And if you look at the research from someone like Victim Support, for example, the actual impact of hate crime is much more significant on the individual than it is in terms of sort of those crimes which don't target your identity. And so we have to remember that whether it's offline, so whether it's in the street or whether it's online, it's still about that core attack on your individual identity. And so that is really where the impact comes from. And someone such as Paul Agansky, for example, who's been researching hate crime on other manifestations, will say that what happens with hate crime is that when somebody is attacked because of that, it then has a ripple effect. So it kind of comes out as well. So it's not the fact that you just feel threatened, you feel attacked, you feel anxious in terms of the attack on you because of who you are and what you are. But then your family also feels that as well. That anxiety goes to your family. And then that anxiety goes into your networks. And I think that's the thing. We have to stress that whether it's online or offline, the actual impact and the attack is based on the same premise, and I think that's very important to know.
And I was just going to reiterate that point as well, that these are message crimes as well. It's sending a message to the victim because of their perceived identity, that if anybody else who's part of this group, whether it's a family network or somebody else, the ripple effect impacts quite a lot of people as well as that individual. So it sends a clear message that if this is what you believe in, or this is what you're combating, then you are fair game.
And we heard earlier that in terms of the perpetrators of abuse, we heard about far-right networks online, and also about the age of perpetrators being sort of increasingly younger forms of abuse. Do you have anything to add to that evidence?
Well, what I can sort of say, certainly, there is quite a lot of evidence now that does say younger people are more likely in terms of the types of abuse. There is evidence there, but also it's the nature in which the abuse is sort of given out, but also the way in which the perpetrators are very coordinated. I think there's been a lot here today about the far right. What's interesting in some of the work I've done is that some of these are just ordinary people as well as the far right. So there is a sophisticated network, but when you look at some of the profiles of these individuals, you're finding people who are teachers, who have got like ordinary citizens like you and I, who are involved in some of this sort of rhetoric. And also, trigger events has been discussed that, well, has to be Woolwich, for example, or Paris. But, with some of the work we've done, some more, if you like, mundane events like halal meat sees this spike in anti-Muslim hostility online, especially, or things to do with Sharia, or in 2013 when Channel 4 decided to do the call to prayer, you saw this huge emphasis of anti-Muslim hostility. So it's quite interesting the way those events map out.
I think there's also the issue there in terms of this when we see that maybe young people are increasingly becoming more prone to use this as a medium for hate. Actually, that's probably because young people are using social media, across all walks of their life. So, this is something which is becoming very much the norm. This is becoming something which is very much the way in which they communicate. So the fact that hate crime and hate speech is actually becoming manifested there is probably the same as, it's something that we shouldn't really be too surprised about. I think that as well, the research shows as well that actually the vast majority of hate crime, whether it's perpetrated online or offline, is actually not perpetrated by networks or by the far right. And I think that what we see in terms of, and I would say there's a similarity between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, is that there is a very noticeable and identifiable hardcore element which actually uses these mediums to actually put forward a very, very specific ideology, one which would hate Jews or one which would hate Muslims, depending upon where you'd be looking at that. But I would add that as research shows, is that the vast majority of hate crime, online or offline, actually is undertaken by ordinary people, and it's the kind of context within that, the things that motivate those people to suddenly wish to kind of say something, which is, atrocious or shocking, or threaten somebody because of who they are. That's really where the issue is. So I think that there is a very specific kind of network of hardcore kind of Islamophobes or anti-Semites which work these areas. But I think that we shouldn't put too much of that emphasis or the sole emphasis on those.
Okay.
I mean, I would also agree with that sentiment that a lot of ordinary people are sort of involved in sort of online hate speech, and I think that's reflected in the polling that we've seen, that it's sort of a chicken and egg situation. Are you going to blame the media for sort of promoting certain ideas and narratives, or are we going to then say, look, what happened with the Brexit vote? We can say that Sadiq Khan won in London, but it wasn't as if his opponent didn't get any votes whatsoever. If that was a national vote, perhaps it would have been different, perhaps it would have been more like Brexit. So, we have these sentiments that are sort of being sort of proliferated through society, and social media just provides a medium for those to be expressed. And as we said in our written submission, that sort of the anonymity, especially on Twitter, compared to other platforms, that allows the worst of ourselves to come out. And I think if you want to see what people are actually thinking and not saying on the street, then social media is the place to go to see that. And if hate speech itself is the fuel for hate crime, then where else is the bulk of hate speech expressed other than social media? And when we've looked at the sort of the guidelines and the enforcement mechanisms of these different social media companies, which are just not the two big ones, includes YouTube, includes Yik Yak, includes some other ones as well, which we've included in our written submission, you'll find none of them have robust policy on hate speech itself, except Facebook concedes that it is willing to look at this area. The others only really get involved when it's to do with harm, threats of violence, and I think we can see some of these issues reflected in the work that's been done on gender hate crime, and it's not really clear whether they're into promoting free speech or whether it's like the tabloids. The more traffic they have, the more things that are trending, the better it is for them. Those things are not clear. Only maybe they will be able to highlight what the reason is.
Okay, Stuart MacDonald.
Thank you very much indeed. Just a couple of quick questions. Have any of you done any research into the extent to which fake news has become a generator of Islamophobic sentiment, and is it a significant problem? Nope. All right, thank you very much.
If you want to give us some money, then we'll do the research. I'll happily take it on. Really. You can make that commitment now if you want.
I'll maybe suggest to somebody else that they make that commitment. Okay. Secondly, the government has announced, as you'll know, that it's going to be working alongside the Independent Press Standards Organisation to improve the standard of guidance and training available to journalists. Is that going to be in any way, shape or form effective? Do we need to go much further than that?
Well, what does it mean? Guidance and training in what exactly? Yeah. That would presume that journalists don't know what they're doing. Sure. that when sort of the most sort of prominent recent case that happened was with Fatima Manji of Channel 4. So Ipso acquitted the journalists involved. So if he would have had training, I mean, if you're talking sort of he needs to be sort of de-radicalized or something, maybe. But I think we would need to look at the sort of elaboration of what that means. But definitely Ipso itself needs to be looked at, and sort of the way they regulate. My view has always been that when it comes to social media companies, when it comes to Ipsos, when it comes to regulators, it's not good enough for them to fall back and say, well, we're just abiding by the law. I think it's their job to go beyond the law, if possible, and to look out for other things. And when there are journalists that are going after people's identity, just for being Muslim or just for wearing visible religious symbols, that in itself I cannot see how that can be enough to justify them, sort of having the freedom to express the views that they did about that reporter not reporting on a terrorist news story.
Dr. Allan?
I would just add that if any sort of training is given, I think it's important to go to editors, for example, and to sort of look at the types of language they use, and also the idea of understanding where anti-Muslim sentiment is, so the language, and trying to have a better picture of saying, well, actually, using this terminology is not good in this instance. So some more editorial checks. I know that was discussed previously about the sensitive nature of particular stories. So I would say any sort of training around workshops for journalists would be a positive thing, where they would be able to see, the Islam and the language used about Muslims in a different light.
I mean, I think in some ways there's a correlation between academia and journalism, is that you have to somehow kind of maintain that sense of integrity and freedom, and I don't think that in any way, in terms of the way in which we speak about the media, would we want to put any sort of curbs in terms of the kind of journalistic freedom or journalistic integrity. But I think that one of the things that we also have there is also a sense of responsibility as well, and I think that that's maybe where the differences begin to become apparent, because if myself or one of my colleagues or Imran, for example, was to produce fabricated research evidence and try and deliberately misrepresent the findings that we had, then we would be held accountable for that. And I think that one of the issues is that there's many times when I think a lot of us as people that are researchers, but also a lot of people within communities as well, feel that there's not that accountability when it comes to journalism. So I think that what I'd like, and it's obviously a very, very sensitive balance in trying to get there, but is to some way try and ensure that there is a kind of clear transparency in terms of the accountability of journalists. In the previous session, there was a lot which was mentioned around about the issue of misrepresentation. Very small things around the sort of the issue of a Muslim community, or actually Muslim communities. These very fine nuance where actually it can send out a very different message in terms of the way in which it is. And also again, those kind of big broad headlines, those sort of things. I just think that I think that what I'd like to see is not an actually kind of curtailing of the integrity or the freedom of journalism, but actually the kind of imposition more of a sense of responsibility and then accountability when that responsibility isn't apparent.
So I just wanted to add, I mean, there are two categories here. There are articles that are sort of put forward in the media which you could say potentially stoke hatred, but they would say are based on factual, facts. But there are those which are completely false and fabricated, as we've discussed. Now, is there a mechanism of accountability for when that happens? There is, ipso. But the problem is that process of accountability is not enough to deter the newspapers. When there is a retraction or an apology that appears on page 52 in small type, what needs to happen is that the response to the infringement of the regulation should be proportional. And if it's a huge headline, which is highly problematic and not based on facts, then the apology should be equivalent to that, and there should be serious punitive consequences, financial punitive consequences. If the deterrence isn't there, then the money you make from selling the papers outweighs the minor embarrassment.
Is that not quite a dangerous road to go down, though? You're not getting to infringe on freedom of speech?
Well, in the specific context of newspapers, what excuse of freedom of speech is there to lie?
Well, do you not have maybe the risk then of defensive journalism, that people are beginning to become scared to take on certain stories just because they're scared of the consequences of...
That's why I split them in two categories. I said one is how you frame a story. That's a separate discussion. But I'm talking about where stories are completely fabricated or false or based on false premises. I mean, that's just not factually correct. It's every newspaper's responsibility to report actual stories, surely.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, James Berry.
Yes. Dr. Allan, you raised an interesting point about social media, and you were saying that perhaps there are just a lot of people with these views, but they are expressing all their views on social media, including the unpleasant ones. When we had the chief rabbi giving evidence, he made an interesting point, with anti-Semitism. It's sort of Mrs. and Mr. Smith at the dinner table in Nottingham having an anti-Semitic conversation. It doesn't really affect him. But when it's in his hand, there to see on Twitter, that really does affect him. And it goes a bit further than that, I think, that it eggs other people on and it sort of normalises those views if you see them all the time. Now, social media companies claim it would not be possible to maintain and police the traffic on their platforms. It wouldn't be financially possible to do so because they have to employ so many people. Do you think that is a responsible approach for companies who actually put these platforms out there?
Yeah, I mean, just again, there needs to be context, and it's an interesting analogy because it's one which I use with my students, and I actually say, if you say the things you say in your front room, you don't say in the space at the university, and because we've become sophisticated enough to know what we can say and what we can't say in public, and a lot of the time our kind of prejudices, whether they're minor prejudice or whether they're going to be full blown, as the rabbi was saying, is such that we've become nuanced and sophisticated in that respect to be able to do it. Now, I think in terms of social media, it also becomes the same as well. And without wanting to play down any sort of bigotry or hatred, if you're just texting that to somebody who's sort of your friend, is that any different to having that view in your front room? I think that where it becomes problematic is when it becomes if somebody tweets and they have 2 followers, does that make an impact? What you then have to do is if you've got 1,000 followers and then somebody else has got 1,000 followers and they retweet and retweet and retweet. So I think that I don't think we can talk in blanket terms in terms of this. I think it is that the analogy actually goes a little bit further. I do think that once it goes into the public space, and whether that's where in kind of the kind of public discourse via the kind of mainstream kind of more traditional media, or whether it goes into the mainstream and sort of the public space in terms of social media, I think that, again it's very similar in terms of that. I mean, I think that yes, it does definitely lead to a sense of normalisation. I think that if you do constantly see, sort of diatribes against any particular group, and we've seen this, we can look back over many years and different paradigms and so on, where we can see these kind of things where it becomes much, very normal to kind of other a particular group or so on. So I'm not in any way trying to underestimate or kind of, but I think that we do need to look at this in a more kind of more sophisticated way in terms of that. In terms of how you manage it, I mean, I really don't know. I don't know how you manage this in terms of social media, because within some sort of forms of social media, this is something which is very private, which is between a very small group. With other forms of social media, such as with Twitter or with Facebook, for example, it tends to go to a much larger audience. I mean, I was chatting yesterday, and I think that one of the things that come out of Demos, the Demos presentation, was that some social media platforms have more users than actually citizens of some nations. So how you do that, I don't actually know. I think that what we do have to do, the way forward, is to kind of look at the kind of enforcement. So when it is reported as a problem, then we look at, can we actually enforce, can we use the legislation which is in place to actually then enforce the curbing of that particular behaviour. And that's where legislation and policy works best, in curbing behaviours. That's really where we can really make an impact. And so I think it's about actually using the legislation that we have and using that as a consequence of the reporting, so that it still then comes from the individual that feels vilified or attacked or has become a victim. That way then we actually we can enforce that more so from that point of view.
Gentlemen, do you think that social media companies could and should do more?
I think they should. I mean, we spoke to somebody, and I just use a quote where a picture was put up of an avatar around her, and it said, "You burqa wearing slut," and that was posted, retweeted, shared, and so forth. And she told us when we spoke to her, and I quote, "Social media companies do not act quickly enough." And I think that is important in the sense of reaction, because quite a lot of what we're seeing is reactive elements to deal with this, not being proactively trying to go out and look at whether it's counter messaging protocols or things like that. Now, there was recently social media companies signed up to this code of conduct, and I think much more needs to be done about providing a duty of care to users and others, and people signing up to that, even social media companies, where people make reckless statements that somehow there is an element that there is I hate to use the word, but naming and shaming people. I mean, I've had discussions in the past with Facebook and Twitter and said, it would be good to have a traffic light system where, if people are creating a problem once, that you give them a warning, and then after that, you actually penalise and take them off. But we do know that this is a financial market, and my conversations with Twitter quite often end with them saying, well, sometimes people send tweets at very difficult, different times of the night. They might be drunk, and so we tell them to sit on it. What you've said is wrong. Maybe come back. And I don't think that's acceptable to say, well, actually, what's the broader context? So I think the response to posting but sharing harmful content should also be part of the wider strategy, and that's probably somewhere where social media companies work with the CPS and other organisations to look at guidance given to prosecutors as well when dealing with the types of language we're seeing online, because unfortunately there's quite a lot of people we spoke to that when they reported things, it took forever for Twitter or others to come back to them with a plausible answer. And for example, that lady, Twitter came back to her and said that hasn't breached our guidelines. Okay, so what are the guidelines? And then you go back to the CPS, and I think also this is a multitude platform in the sense that it's not just social media companies. Let's take the police, for example. And I think there's some, it is important to note that there's so much on social media that the police can't feasibly deal with everything. And it is like finding a virtual needle in a haystack. Where do you find it? But if the people that we were speaking to, at least, if they have a lack of trust in the police offline, and if the police don't have the resources adequately able to tackle online, then you can see how trust breeds mistrust in the online space as well, and it goes back to that connection. So, that would be my summary.
So it's interesting that one thing that we explored in one of our previous reports was one of our colleagues being trolled with the hashtag filthy Jew or filthy Jew bitch. Now, that is very easy to identify, and even now, just whilst I've been sitting here, I've found dozens of tweets using that hashtag, and it would be very easy, because that's quite specific, for Twitter to sort of automatically quarantine any message with that, to review it before allowing it to go out, or maybe just not allowing it at all, because it's obviously going to be offensive and highly derogatory, but they don't seem to take any proactive responsibility, because doing so would mean they're responsible for what's on their content, on their platform, including copyright breaches and other things. And it seems they've created something that they're saying is so big that it's impossible to police in any way.
Absolutely, and it's like that the hashtag kill all Muslims that was trending.
I bet you can find stuff on there now.
You can still find stuff on there now, and the multiple accounts that people are creating, and the fact that, when we did our study, we found quite a lot of derogatory terms for Muslims, referring to them as muzzrats, vermin, disease. Those were not being picked up by Twitter because they hadn't understood that muzzrats was a demeaning way to describe Muslims. So the language of that is also, I think, a problem, and you refer to it in terms of, I think there is a link, as Chris mentioned before, between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in that context as well.
But just in that respect, wouldn't somebody just remove the hashtag? Because then you wouldn't be able to pick it up.
That's true, but Twitter have chosen not to do that despite it being criticised in a previous report.
So you could actually stop that, but immediately all you need to do is remove one character.
When Twitter reports on trends, it picks up the word as well as the hashtag. It doesn't just pick up hashtag, it picks up the actual word.
More sort of precise examples of things that either Twitter or any other social media company could do that they are currently not doing, and I think the more precision the better. I mean, for example, issues that we've had raised with us around Twitter before would be, first of all, length of time to provide any kind of response. Secondly, not having high enough standards and potentially having different kinds of standards in terms of content. Thirdly, not using algorithms or other kinds of approaches to identify abuse. And fourthly, not preventing repeat abuse, so somebody, even if they've got a criminal case against them, being able to simply reappear as someone else, and set up a new account. Those are kind of four I've had raised with me in terms of Twitter, but there's a whole series of other social media companies and forums, and maybe those are, even on the Twitter ones, are ones that you think are appropriate or aren't. But I think the more specificity, we go around the houses a lot with quite general requests on social media companies. Are there specific things that you think they could and should do that they don't?
I mean, these companies, the concept behind them is that it's to do with user content. So like YouTube has, I think other social media companies should also have means by which users themselves can flag posts. Of course, it's people who are seeing these people who are feeling the hate or suffering, so they can report it themselves. But also, I think the anonymity on Twitter is a huge problem, and that's something that they need to look at. Which for them, that'll be a big thing, because if they introduce any sort of further checks on identity and so on, it will hamper their own performance and the edge they have over Facebook. And I would go back to sort of having more robust guidelines, and even where the guidelines do exist, we've already heard that the enforcement mechanisms just are not fast enough, and I think that's just not acceptable for social media companies to say that we've created a monster that we cannot control. At least come up with the guidelines that sort of put out your intention for trying to stop this sort of hate speech, and then we can talk about how we can enforce that. But in many companies' situations, that's not even the case yet.
I would just reiterate some of the points I made earlier. So whether it's a traffic light system or something that either you give somebody a warning, you name and shame people. I think, I know Facebook, when we've had discussions, they were quite interested in the idea, but were quite worried also about, that element. I also think a specific report button or something that looks at racism and bigotry could be important. I know Twitter have been in discussions about anti-harassment tools, but at the moment, the idea is to block, mute, report. And I think that doesn't deal with it, especially when we're trying to deconstruct what the tweet was about. So the one about filthy Jews, for example, why isn't there a way of reporting this as racial prejudice and hostility of that nature? So some sort of mechanism that they can put in, whether that's a report button might be one suggestion. Also, I think the contextual analysis around when people send tweets out. So, for example, there's many times Twitter have said, well, this doesn't breach our community guidelines because somebody's called somebody a packy, for example. It doesn't breach our guidelines. And I think there is a proactive element that has to say, well, how many tweets are you checking of this individual? Is this person a serial offender? Have they committed, when did they commit the offence? Are the images and the pictures they're using, are they inciting hatred? May not be breaching the law, but is it inciting racial hatred? I think there needs to be much more deeper evidence base for them to do that. And I also think what would really be helpful is an online archive of hate incidents. So if somebody is reporting these incidents, that they're able to collect the evidence so that it helps in a prosecution, because quite often you've got users taking screenshots, and that might be one way of evidence. But why don't Twitter have a mechanism where an individual can just store files? It can be moved swiftly through the police, through other agencies, and you have an archive that will help improve the prosecution rate. Because at the moment, some of the victims we spoke to said, this was quite an interesting finding when we talk about barriers of hate crime. First of all, they weren't aware they were a victim of a hate crime. They said, really, is this a hate crime? So they weren't aware. But secondly, they were not sure how to report and how to gather the material evidence. And because we hear, quite often when we hear about the case studies of people who have been prosecuted, it's celebrities who have been victimized. But some sort of, case study where we can see that would help. And I think that could be done through that online archive system.
I just think that we can only really approach, and this is my own view, which is probably slightly different to yours. I think that it is such a huge problem. I'm not sure, that you can actually really police this too well, because you can immediately just remove a hashtag. You can, close one account and reopen another account. The whole nature of it is actually that it gives you that fluidity to be able to kind of use it in whichever way you wish, whether that's for good or bad. So I think that the only way forward is to actually look at take it from the victim's point of view, to actually look at it from the victim's point of view, and actually look at prosecuting from that basis. I'm not sure that you can really police it from a top down way. That would be more.
Yeah, no, I definitely I definitely agree that there's an issue of policing it. But even I think social media workshops or training for those people within social media companies would be advantageous. So
Shaikh, you referred to Yik Yak and others not having any community standards at all.
No, I said it in relation to this particular area. So what we're talking about is hate crime specifically, and then they can split it into the different sort of protected heads. You know, we protect for these and this and this. So when it comes to, for example, what kind of sort of speech do they consider hateful or that they should not regulate? In most situations, some companies don't have anything on them. When it comes to Twitter, YouTube, then it's purely about violent threats or imminent harm being caused or things of the nature. Even when there are some guidelines which refer to sort of racial or religious hatred, it's more to do with, it has to be directed to a specific individual. It cannot be a general sort of statement. But like I said to you, Facebook was the only company that sort of acknowledged, made the distinction between, when it comes to sort of religious hatred, that there's a distinction to be made between religious identity, as in, are you going after the person, and the sort of, you know, Muslims this and Muslims that, effing Muslims, or are you making criticism of the religion, no matter how misinformed, no matter how hateful. They were the only ones, and that's the correct route to go down if we are going to talk about regulation.
Okay, Nasha.
Dr. Awan, specifically to yourself, in 2014, following the Trojan horse issue in Birmingham schools, you were quoted as saying, Muslim communities in Birmingham feel vilified and that they are being unfairly labelled as extremists. To me, the most significant outcome of this whole affair is the damage caused to community cohesion and diversity, which was one of Birmingham's key strengths. My question is, and I'd like you to expand and elaborate, and I'd like to understand what your view is on the government's response, or whether the government's response and tone can impact on hate speech following incidents like this.
Okay, so in terms of Trojan horse, what's interesting is as a regional or local event, it was leading to quite a level of anxiety and fear within Muslim communities. So that study you're referring to was one where we went out and spoke to children, teachers and others who have been impacted by the whole Trojan horse affair. And the sort of key salient message quite often was that it's a political rhetoric that's led to this, and there was a real sense that they felt that they were being vilified and that it was impacting on their children's education. But online, what's interesting again is a local regional event like that still spurs a level of animosity, in the sense of people targeting people because they were linked to that particular school. So, for example, it was the Parkview Academy, which is now called Rockwood Academy, I believe, where hashtags were being used to target teachers or children who were actually going to that school. So they were, if you like, seeing this level of animosity. And this is coming back to what I mentioned before about trigger events. That not all of them necessarily have to be international. You can see local, regional events like Trojan horse. So that was the sort of impact that it was having on those people that we spoke to.
So it continues to have an impact?
Yes, yeah.
Sorry, could I just, what was the last part of the question? I didn't catch the last part.
So what I'm trying to, whether the government's response or tone can impact on hate speech following incidents like this.
So can I just come in on that point?
Yeah, of course.
Because I think that in the previous session there was a question about mainstream politicians making statements around sort of problematic, and there was a prime one in terms of the Trojan horse, and Tony Blair used the UN platform to make the comparison. He said that it was in June 2014, and he said that the Islamic extremism which inspired Boko Haram to kidnap 200 girls in Nigeria was the same Islamic extremism which was evident in Birmingham schools. And I think that is a prime example of completely and utterly inaccurate statements about Muslims. From that, what you get in the media is you get the reporting of this and the assumption that actually all Muslims are the same. It doesn't matter if they're in Afghanistan, whether they're in Sparkbrook in Birmingham, whether they're in Nigeria, or whether they're in sort of Small Heath in Birmingham. All Muslims are the same, and the capabilities are the same. And I think there's another couple of things which which I think that particularly in the Birmingham context, because obviously myself and Imran both work and do a lot of our research in the city. And I think that Trojan Horse didn't kind of happen in a vacuum in terms of the city. A few years before, we had Project Champion, where we had over 200 cameras, CCTV and ANPR cameras, put around two of the most densely populated Muslim areas in the city. Initially, it was there as they were high risk, kind of high crime areas, but then it came out that they were actually funded by money around kind of counter-terrorism, and so we have this whole thing. And so I think that one of the things that you get with this, and what the Trojan Horse comes on the back of this, is that you get this idea that there's no smoke without fire. Why do these things keep happening? So when you have sort of Tony Blair saying this, when you have the police putting up 200 cameras around Muslim areas, when you have like kind of letters being published in national newspapers, which are really kind of, even West Midlands Police said it quite soon after was a hoax. What you're actually getting though is you're getting this kind of feeding into this kind of noise, this background noise, this white noise that exists there. And around Muslims in particular in the city is that there can't be no smoke without fire. There must be Muslims in there who are terrorists. There must be Muslims who are waiting to do these things. So it creates an animosity between Muslims and non-Muslim communities within the city. And I think that becomes really, really problematic. And I think it's become something, that we then see, again, we can look at the American media with Fox News, and Birmingham becomes described as an area which is run by Sharia police, and this suddenly goes out to, sort of a global audience. And so I think that if we're looking at the way in which all of this ties up and then bringing that in as well, where Imran was saying that on the online spaces, then you begin to get kind of hate speech coming through there. You can see the way in which the offline and the online actually connect. You can see the way in which the political discourse actually feeds into that, but you can also see the way in which it has that impact at the social level as well.
I think I also wanted to actually go back to that earlier question about which mainstream politicians may be saying things which may be contributing sort of sentiments within the public. And I think the schools is a good example. And in relation to the question, I would say sort of the rhetoric that was coming out of David Cameron, and specifically how it was entrenched in the counter-extremism strategy which he presided over. It contains a whole host of things, including the Trojan Horse affair, which sort of feed into these tropes and narratives, and it's very difficult to see how they can be classified or be linked or be related to a yet sort of hazy concept of extremism. Included the incident with Lutfur Rahman in Tower Hamlets as being an example of corruption and extremism, FGM, the paedophile rings, and taxi drivers. What do they have to do with sort of Islamic extremism? And I give evidence to the Citizens Commission on Public Participatory Integration of Muslims, and they asked for further evidence, which I can forward to the committee as well, where they asked a similar question, and I produced a very long document of things that David Cameron had said, which are not Islamophobic, but they're in this sort of blurry, hazy area, which Nigel Farage is in a lot of the time, of leaving the space open for a connection between, for example, ISIS and Muslims generally. And I think if you leave that space open, then you're not the one populating it, but it does eventually get populated.
Okay, David Winnick.
It's no consolation that if something's wrong, it's worse elsewhere. I accept that entirely. But when one looks at various places in Europe at the moment, particularly France, in Holland, and one can name one or two other places, but particularly France, one has in mind. I mean, the situation here, presumably you would agree, is nowhere near the same when it comes to prejudice and hatred against Muslims.
Well, one of the things I would say is that last year was the 50th anniversary of the first piece of race relations legislation in the UK, and I think that we were the first country in Europe to actually introduce that type of legislation. So I think, yes, we have a great tradition of being at the forefront of beginning to tackle, or seeking to tackle any form of discrimination. And I think that one of the great things about us is that, when we look at sort of, proportionality, we have legislation which protects, the trans community as much as it does the black and Asian communities, which are much more significant. So I would say yes, actually yes, it is. From my own interactions at the European level, I would say that we are, in many ways advanced here. But I don't think we should sit back, and we should actually sort of take it forward. One of the first people on the panel previously spoke about the event in Sweden, where it was the Swedish government were talking about how do we tackle Islamophobia. I participated in that event as well, and Sweden were very, very keen to look at the British, the kind of example which was set by Britain. So I think with all of this is actually, all of these things are extremely positive. And I think that all of our history in terms of trying to tackle discrimination, any discriminatory phenomena, is fantastic. We should be credited for that. But I think we should still keep pushing on with that. And that's why I think that in terms of Islamophobia and in terms of other forms of discrimination which are beginning to emerge, I think that we should still strive to be at the forefront of that.
On the basis that you agree with that, if you don't, obviously, with the short-term time, I asked the previous with the panel about political impact on anti-Muslim prejudice, and mentioned, as you may, if you were in the room, I believe you were, the situation in the United States, the triumph of Trump and the sort of rhetoric he used, blatantly anti-Muslim, which he would never have got away with if he used such rhetoric against Jews. Do you feel that the impact of Trump and the fact, unfortunately, as I see it, that he succeeded in his campaign, he's president-elect, as you know, do you think that will have any impact on public opinion in this country?
I mean, I think sort of Trump is part of, appears to be sort of an international sort of increase in appeal of the right, as it were, populist right. And we discussed in the previous session about Steve Bannon and Breitbart. It's important to note that his website was one of the main sort of influences that came out in the trial of Anders Breivik, for example. And when we look at, for example, what happened with Thomas Mehr as well, we can see that his influences are sort of far right as well. And what Trump represents is sort of the link between that extreme far neo-Nazi white supremacist right to sort of the general public. He occupied that space in the middle. And sort of, if you want to know whether that has an impact on the UK and what the public think here, then you just have to look at the figures in support of UKIP. I think they're sort of representing a similar kind of politics. And if their support goes up, then we can see that it does have a knock-on effect.
I'd just add that I think there was some research done recently about when Trump was elected and a rise in hate incidents in the US. I think what's interesting in terms of the UK context is there was quite a lot of fear at the time. People worried, especially with the idea of banning Muslims to the United States of America. But going back to social media, what's interesting is the power to counter that narrative. And there's quite a lot of, I think, good examples where people were using hashtags to say, well, I am a Muslim, I am American, and I'm proud. And I think that type of sort of language, if you can flood the use of social media, especially with a counter positive message, you suddenly see in the level of spike go decrease as well, because people are now thinking, well, actually, hang on here. And this is coming back to your question about social media companies, maybe them helping push that hashtag higher up the trend is always a good thing. So I think, yes, it could have an impact, but I was quite happy at the way in which people were responding through either those hashtags, but a wider question of actually using humour and satire to counter it. And I think sometimes we don't take that seriously enough, and I think that type of thing is really powerful, especially when people are using things to try and demonise and dehumanize individuals.
So I just wanted to add, there is a direct impact. For example, when there was a discussion of Muslim ban, it just came to me that, for example, Katie Hopkins and Melanie Phillips, they immediately published a column supporting it. So, I mean, whatever happens there, it does create debate and discussion here.
One of the things that so the Southern Poverty Law Centre, which records hate crimes on various markers in the US, they saw that in the week after the election in the US, there was the same number of anti-Muslim incidents, hate crimes being reported in 1 week as there was in 6 months previously. So what we see a sharp impact. And the reason why I say that's important is because if you look at the work of Stuart Hall, who was the first black professor in the UK and pushed forward the idea of cultural studies, Stuart Hall said that actually political discourse informs common sense. And he said that politicians, with their discourse and what they tell the public through their rhetoric, will actually create what is common sense. Common sense isn't a kind of grassroots thing or kind of ground up thing that we kind of believe in. It's actually something which we're kind of told and we're informed and shaped. And one of the things from that is that it becomes very difficult if the President of the United States is saying it's okay to hate Muslims. Then how can you actually stop the perpetrators of hate crime? Because they will say, well, if he can say it, why can't I? And so I think that's where you will see where the impact will be.
Point well taken.
It will be in terms of the tone.
One more question from David Winnick. One more question from Naz Shah. Before I let you conclude, David, does any of the other committee members have questions?
Dr. Awan, you mentioned satire. I'm just wondering if some of the programmes on television, which includes Muslims but it pokes fun of them at each other, at fellow Muslims, do you think that helps? I mean, the general feeling is that it gets away from sort of issues that we've been discussing and looks at people as human beings, as all other human beings are, with their weaknesses and the rest of it.
Absolutely. I think one of the proudest things of being British is our sense of humour. And I think using satire and sort of actually reversing the sort of pernicious ideology of people saying, well, actually, Muslims are not contributing, they're an other, there's a this and a them. I think that type of light-hearted humour can have a real impact for people to say, well, actually, I live next to a Muslim. I've never ever asked them about this question. I think I am going to ask them this time because I have the sort of, I'm open enough to ask them because I've seen something that's quite interesting. So I think there is a space for having that, of course, being respectful of various other things to do with free speech and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the issues around normalisation is absolutely crucial. I mean, I think at the moment Muslims and Islamists still seen to be other. If you look at the kind of research from the University of Cardiff from 2008, it showed that actually in terms of actual kind of press media and broadcast media, the tendency now is not to present Muslims in terms of being a kind of violent other, but in terms of kind of cultural other. So actually they're against our way of life, our culture, our sort of values and so on and so on, in terms of that. So I think that anything in terms of kind of which kind of brings Muslims into being seen to be normal rather than abnormal, seen to be normal rather than other, I think is fantastic. And I think that one of the things which actually be that is when you start to see Muslims being asked about issues that are not Muslim issues. And and my view, something which came up in the last section, is that I personally don't think that Muslim groups should be releasing statements and press releases about events that involve Muslims in other parts of the world if it doesn't specifically affect them, because I think that still that implication is there that somehow they're linked to that. So I think that actually let's talk to Muslim groups about non-Muslim issues. That would be great.
Okay, Nasha.
Hi, just one final question for me, really. Dr. Allan, you've been I understand that you've been critical at times of the definitions given to Islamophobia, and I'd like to ask you, do you feel it should be on the government to either adopt or clearly define a working definition that separates legitimate criticism from an act of hate?
Yeah, I think the problem is, because I was thinking about this in the previous section. I was trying to think why, because I wanted to join in that section. And I think that one of the reasons being is that we've not had any policies which have kind of necessitated the need for a definition. And so what we have various different sources. I've tried to define it in terms of a very academic way. We've had things such as Runnymede Trust. We've tried to put it in a kind of much more kind of it's got a kind of mainstream kind of accessible way. There are things like the Council of Europe as well. They've come up with definitions as well. I think that one of the things is that actually now I get the feeling that we are moving to that space where we need to begin to negotiate some sort of form of definition which is widely acceptable. Unfortunately, I haven't seen the definition of anti-Semitism which was accepted yesterday, but so I'd be very interested in looking at that. But one thing I would just say, in terms of policy, in terms of legislation, I think that it'd be very easy. I think that we could look at the kind of very similar, there's strong similarities between racism, between anti-Semitism, between homophobia, between Islamophobia. There's no hierarchy in any of these. On the whole, they all function exactly the same way. And I think that where we are now is probably that space where we need to begin to actually work together to come up with a definition. And I think that maybe using the definition of anti-Semitism is a good start point. But I think that if we could get that, I think that would be a major step forward. And I think that if we have a kind of policy and political kind of drive to get that, then I think that may be taken more seriously than if an academic's trying to write, a 60-page book on what it means.
I mean, I think it's imperative that we move in that direction, and perhaps the adopted definition of anti-Semitism can provide the impetus for that. And I think if you look at a lot of the discussions and debates that go on about what should be done about Islamophobia, what is happening, what's happening on different levels, social media, traditional media, on the street, then the ambiguity of what it means and what it should mean, I think plays into that. On one spectrum, we have people who say that it doesn't exist. How can you be phobic of a religion? And on the other hand, you have some elements potentially who are misinformed and who say any criticism related to religion should be banned. But I mean, our view, and we've elaborated it, is that we're in a post-World War II, post-Holocaust, post-Stephen Lawrence society. And it doesn't really make sense from any perspective whatsoever that if abuse or insults or bigotry or hatred is aimed towards Muslims for being Muslim, that how that's any different from the lessons we've learned from those past events, whether it's to do with black people or Jewish people.
Okay, we're about to run out of time, so final question, Nusrat Ghani.
Very quick, thank you, Doctor. I'm sorry that you weren't able to be in the first session. But I think what was important about what was adopted by 56 countries on anti-Semitism was that everyone accepted what was having a Jewish identity. And what I was trying to draw out in the earlier session was that there are many different forms of Muslims who themselves identify themselves as Muslims, but there are other Muslim representatives who don't. So there can be Islamophobic incidences within Muslim communities. If we were to come up with what you're suggesting, what I was suggesting, it's going to be quite difficult across the Muslim community to accept who can and cannot feel they've been a victim of Islamophobic behaviour.
And that's absolutely fine. I don't think that, I would imagine within Jewish communities there's actually differences of opinion which are exactly the same. I mean, I would say that, as a white British person, living in Birmingham, who's born just across the water, there, I don't really have too much in common with my Brummy colleagues a lot of the times, and so so we don't have to agree on everything, and also as well, with the prescription of national action, no one's actually asking me to apologise for them or even assuming that they speak for me. So so I think that we can have that space where actually we can have differences of opinion. We can have Muslims who agree with us, agree on some things, and Muslims who don't agree. But I think that when it comes back to hate crime, irrespective if it's a gay Muslim, a heterosexual Muslim, a male or female, that person is being attacked because they're Muslim. And that's the issue, and actually that's what we should always remember in terms of that. It's about the hate crime, not about what type of Muslim that they might be.
Absolutely. I was just going to add very quickly, I think it's also important from that definition point of view for the victim, because a lot of the research shows that victims are not aware whether they've been a victim of a hate crime. So to have some sort of sense of solid interpretation of, well, actually this you fall into this category or you don't. But coming back to the point mentioned, I think intra-violence, intra-Islamophobia, especially against certain communities, because of what they believe in, also is important for them to feel confident that, well, actually, hang on, we're suffering Islamophobia within our own community, and that's an important factor.
Thank you. Very brief point.
Okay, yeah. I was just going to say, when it comes to discrimination law and sort of minorities and so on, it's normally the perception of the perpetrator that matters.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We appreciate your time and your evidence today. Order. We conclude our session today. Thank you.